On this episode of The Unraveling, How Your Reality is Made Up. So when this adult man interviewed her, somehow the question turns to spanking. And then it gets weirder. Why is Lavetta name-dropping a Nazi spy as her role model? Getting supplies involved driving 6 hours round trip on bad roads. Be sure to take some money for bribes.
It's not easy. It's not easy sitting even in this house that once had a lot of guns. People packed their guns here.
We need groceries and money to pay the local staff.
The power dynamics at Strongheart, giving Black people your leftover garbage and expecting them to be grateful for it.
Last night, we had electronic games night, which meant a giant image of Wii Tennis projected onto the wall.
It's psychologically unsafe and it's professionally indefensible.
It is what it is, right? And I think we're not making any legal conclusions. That's not our job. Our job is to put out there what the facts are, what the truth is, and let the attorneys conclude what they may.
When you know something and you're putting these things together and you're just like, oh my gosh, I feel like this is one of the biggest things in the world.
And this is a story about people who are saying one thing and something else is going on behind the scenes.
Part of what my NGO does is we work with kids from exceptional young people from extreme circumstances.
Who are you when you're off camera? Who are you in the dark?
I don't think I'd want someone to make a film about my nonprofit. You don't want to see the sausage being made.
Because we don't believe victims. We don't believe the less powerful person ever.
This whole time, it's been in plain sight.
Have things that are hidden be made visible. At least you can see the snake now. This is big, right? This is big. How far does this thing go?
What if your greatest enemy was camouflaged, posing in your life? Perhaps your closest confidant, a family member, or a favorite politician. Exploiting your weaknesses, sabotaging your goals, learning your vulnerabilities. And what would you do if they framed you for a crime you didn't commit? What would you do if they turned your friends against you, convinced everyone you were delusional? And what would you do if they hired a lawyer to weaponize a cease and desist against you? Would you stay quiet? What would you do if no one believed you? How far would they go for a lie? And how far would you go for the truth? A true psychological horror story about how our society is shaped, not by left or right, man or woman, religious or secular, but by predators and prey. Follow me down a rabbit hole of manipulation, power, and psychological warfare, where reality is constructed, not communicated. A journey that reshaped my entire understanding of trust, credibility, and ultimately had me asking, what does it even mean to be human? A story of deception, manipulation, and power so sophisticated and orchestrated, it's almost like it was scripted. This is The Unraveling.
It was a scary experience because you take a person from the bush and you put them in the city. What gonna happen to your mind?
Yeah.
You're gonna get a shock. So I was shocked by so many things. I didn't know how to ride escalator, and I saw it for the first time at the airport in Atlanta, and I was crying. I want to go back Africa because I didn't know, and I didn't know how to ride. So it's hard. It wasn't just like, oh, I like it. No.
That's one of the Freeman kids from the sibling group that Corey found and recruited while they were living in a refugee camp. She is describing her first trip to America when Strongheart flew her to Tucson, Arizona to speak at an event for PepsiCo. I can't find any evidence of a payment for Grace's appearance in the 990 for that year, and they really could have used it because that year the donations were exceedingly low at only $33,000. That, along with Lavetta's jewelry sales, is not much to sustain a house for 8 to 12 children plus staff. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We'll circle back around to that money trail later. But before we examine the nightmare that was Strongheart House, I want to talk about culture shock and the psychological impacts that these experiences were having on these kids. Going from a refugee camp to American life would be a culture shock for anyone. But Lavetta wasn't just anywhere. She was in LA, hobnobbing with celebrities' kids, at her private Santa Monica school. In one article, they shared this anecdote.
Asked if anything surprised her about America, she responds, "I didn't expect to see homeless people." She doesn't say it accusingly, just notes it as a fact. She even says there's nothing wrong with it. And that seems to be said not in an effort not to offend Americans, but simply as an acknowledgement of a reality that probably can't ever be completely changed.
So we can see she's already modifying her opinions and her speech to make sure that she doesn't offend her host. The director also recounts a story about taking Lovetta to a friend's home. On her friend's wall were black and white photographs of two African women carrying water.
And Lovetta said, "Are those friends of hers?" And I said, "No, it's art." And she said, she doesn't even know them. And it was so odd to her, like, why would you have just random pictures of people on your wall? And I said, well, she thinks they're beautiful. And she said, does she know that that hurts their neck? Does she know that I don't want to walk around with that on my head? And someone pointed out yesterday, like, oh, your misery is our art.
Going from the extreme poverty to being around extreme wealth would be shocking and destabilizing for anyone. We know that Lovetta speaks at high-profile events and school classrooms, as well as small group events at restaurants and private homes. But what is that like for her? Strongheart touted her speaking at the Texas Conference for Women as a guest of Texas Governor Rick Perry and First Lady Anita Perry. I did not realize that director had strong connections to Republican politicians.
Although she is strong in heart, she knows that at times the challenges can be daunting on her. When I was addressing the Texas Women Conference in Texas, I was frankly nervous because these were educated women from all walks of life, and there I was, a little girl from Liberia, still in high school, addressing them, she said. And it was a big challenge for me because I nearly lost my composure.
At her much-touted appearance with the Dalai Lama, she also had trouble holding her composure. Are these kids being put in situations that they're not really ready for? At another event, Lovetta spoke to a class of high school students and answered their questions.
Street kids who doesn't have a meal to eat and they die from this, and people don't really care about them. And it breaks my heart a lot because I know how I feel like to be hungry.
If there was one thing that you think Liberians could teach Americans to sort of like make our culture stronger, what do you think that would be?
To appreciate more. And I think that's really important, and you can get up and have for one meal, you're super lucky, and go to a great school and have good friends. That's like a blessing right there. Like really mean that you really appreciate it because you are so lucky every day and night as you live your lives.
This question is so insensitive and offensive. And the fact that Lovetta was subjected to it in front of an entire room of people just adds to the trauma. This girl is pouring out a lifetime of pain. And your question is, yeah, but how can it make us in the US stronger? These are exactly the kind of re-traumatizing and triggering questions that she should not have been subjected to. And I'm not blaming the teenager, but I am blaming the adults who should have vetted those questions instead of just letting anybody say anything they wanted to her, regardless of how re-traumatizing it might be. But it wasn't only unvetted teens who had access to say whatever they wanted to Lovetta. It seems like there was little to no cultural understanding or trauma-informed care for this vulnerable girl. But it wasn't only unvetted teens who had access to say whatever they wanted to Lovetta. A male blogger from Minnesota shared this.
Meeting her in the Twin Cities on July 2nd was an honor and a blessing for me. I contacted her website once, and that was it. She called my phone all day and left me countless messages. Although I was very busy at the time, she was visiting family members in the Twin Cities. I had to buy out time for this young Liberian girl.
So we know that the director is putting Lovetta in as much press as possible. And from this blog post, it appears that she's leaving Lovetta to respond to any adult that contacts her through the website. That's remarkably dangerous. Lovetta should not have had access to private communications with unvetted adults that she meets on the internet. That's obvious, right? It doesn't take a genius to understand the risks to child welfare here. What else does that blog say?
But those are not the only challenges that Lovetta faces. As a young girl with international appeal, many young boys, too, look at her with admiration, but also with some intents she's very well aware of. Oh yeah, she admits. I know how easily girls can get pregnant at this age. But that's why I don't have friends. The temptation out there is too much, but I have a lot to do that I hardly have any time for boys. The upbringing from my father is helping me a lot. My dad would spank me if I did not do the right thing, and he has the right to still spank me today if I do the wrong things.
So when this adult man interviewed her over the phone for this blog post, he made a point of telling her that many young boys are after her and that their intentions are not humanitarian. That is wildly inappropriate. And then somehow the question turns to spanking, and he publishes a teenage girl talking about being spanked by an adult man, something that is a known turn-on to adult men. I can't read this as anything but inappropriate sexualization of a minor. And all of this is happening right under Corey's nose without any oversight. But she's in Hollywood. I'm sure that's a safe place for a beautiful, vulnerable teenage girl, right? But wait, though in 2006, when she arrived, Corey said that Lavetta would live with her in LA, but this 2007 article reports that Lavetta now lives in Austin.
She is living in Austin, attending school as part of the Fellowship in Designing Jewelry, whose proceeds benefits the refugees in Liberia.
So what happened? Did Corey move to Austin, or is Lavetta living with someone else now? And where is she going to school? Lavetta has a lot of pressure put on her that is completely inappropriate. This Texas News article reports it this way.
Her project right now is to help raise enough money to build a Strongheart house for a group of kids in the refugee camp who have no parents and family left. Building a Strongheart house is part of the way Lavetta is trying to pay back the help she's received before and since coming to the United States last Christmas.
That is a major red flag. When adults meet a child's basic needs, the child doesn't owe them anything. Housing, stability, safety, those aren't favors or loans, and they're definitely not leverage to extract labor, fundraising, or public performance and gratitude. The moment a program implies that care must be repaid, especially by a minor who has already lost so much, they're no longer providing care. They're cultivating dependency and obligation. That's coercion. The psychological framing of, quote, Lavetta paying back the help she received, it does three things all at one time. Number one, it plants the belief that survival itself is a debt. If a child must repay adults for not letting them starve or sleep on the street, the power imbalance becomes absolute. Gratitude is now a permanent leash, and you can never take it off. Two, it weaponizes morality. If she hesitates, disagrees, or wants any kind of autonomy, now she looks ungrateful or selfish. That's a psychological trap. We saved you, therefore you owe us, is textbook coercion. Three, it turns the child into the organization's spokesperson and revenue generator. On the official Strongheart website, it says,
with the election of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf in Lavetta's home country of Liberia, the first female president in Africa, Lavetta is anxious to help rebuild the country. Her incredible drive to help others comes from, as she puts it, all of the people who have helped me. I want to help others the way so many have helped me.
By continually attributing the idea of the Strongheart House to Lavetta, it obscures the fact that Strongheart is really Corey's brainchild and lifelong dream. So whose idea is it really, and who's profiting off of it? Supposedly, Lavetta is raising money for her future and for refugee kids. But notice who actually benefits. The organization's brand, narrative, and expansion, not the kids. It's PR disguised as empowerment. When a 15-year-old child is made to believe that she must repay adults for the bare minimum of care, that's not philanthropy. It's conditioning. And it's one of the clearest tells that the entire structure was built to extract from her, not to support her. If Lavetta is being used as a theatrical fundraising tool, as I suspect, it would explain why this article in The National is full of lies. In April 2010, this article makes several false claims. One, that Lavetta's necklaces had only made $20,000 by that point. But the year before, they grossed $122,000. Two, Lavetta won the International Children's Peace Prize. She did not win, she was only a finalist. And three, that she now lives in the house with, quote, other talented Liberians. But in April 2010, it was just her and the staff. The rest of the fellows hadn't yet arrived. And then it gets weirder. Why is Lavetta name-dropping a Nazi spy as her role model?
Of course, war is not Kanto's only inspiration. I'm a huge fan of Coco Chanel, she says. I find her work elegant, beautiful, sexy, and cute. At the same time, her clothes make people look and feel like women. They make you suddenly appear more confident. I'd like to start designing clothes myself, she says. If and when that happens, there will be some Chanel-inspired designs. As Kanto's career flourishes, she will be mindful of two things. I always think of the lotus flower, she says. It grows in mudflats and proves that beauty can come from hostile places. The second comes from Coco Chanel, who famously said, in order to be irreplaceable, one must always be different. Kanto is certainly that.
The director is a master of PR and publicity. She never allows anything to be published unless she wants it published. So I have to wonder, what kind of a dog whistle was that? And who was it for?
Are you looking for a nonprofit you can start today? No experience, qualifications, or oversight required? Tired of building codes, ethics standards, or background checks getting in the way of your savior complex? Try opening an orphanage in Africa. No reliable electricity? No problem. No running water, paved roads, or child protection services. Even better. You'll fit right in with thousands of other untrained volunteers finding themselves through someone else's suffering. Because nothing says, I'm a good person, like flying to another country to create a new attachment wound for destitute children.
What if you could identify the next Martin Luther King, Paul Farmer, or Nelson Mandela? What if you could bring them together, give them an excellent education, and expose them to an incredible array of maverick leaders in areas as diverse as science, human rights, ethics, economics? What if you could bring them together, give them an excellent education, and expose them to an incredible array of maverick leaders in areas as diverse as science, human rights, ethics, economics? What if you could change their world, and they could change the world for us all? The Strong Heart Fellowship Program is a groundbreaking social entrepreneurship residency program designed to develop exceptional young people into innovative problem solvers and leaders that can affect significant social change.
That was the promise made by Corey Shepard Stern, Hollywood producer turned homemade humanitarian. For several years, Strong Heart's main source of funding is Lovetta's necklace sales. In 2010, her jewelry sales bring in over $100,000 alone, quite a bit more than the donations. That same year, Corey led several 10-day mission trips to rehab the Strong Heart House. Photographs document volunteer labor performing the renovations, and in 2010, Lovetta moves in as the first fellow. That year, their operating costs were about $170,000, and Lovetta raised most of that. Is it legal to fund a children's home with money made by the children's own labor? I don't think so. On the tax forms, she claims that the jewelry is, quote, a byproduct of the program, of which the main purpose is the education of the fellow. But how can education be your main purpose if you have no curriculum, supplies, accreditation, or licensed instructors? Also, according to that same 2010 tax form, both Corey Shepard Stern and her co-founder, Zoe Adams, worked full-time at 50 hours per week for very modest salaries. The director's was $33,000, and Zoe Adams was paid $27,000. And that's odd because 2010 is also the same year that the director begins production on her very first documentary film, Bending the Arc. She's filming in Haiti after the earthquake and following the Partners in Health team. So how is she also working 50 hours a week for Strong Heart? And there's still more weirdness in these tax forms. The first year, the fellow expenses are listed at $52,000, but the following year, they're only $32,000. But that doesn't make any sense because in the first half of 2010, Lovetta was the only fellow living at the Strong Heart House. So how is it less expensive to host more fellows? And yet another red flag I notice on this 990, they say that they're using the cash accounting method, but they're claiming depreciation. Depreciation is a non-cash expense that can only be used in the accrual method, not in the cash method that they're using. So other than salaries, what else did they get for that $170,000? Well, the Santa Cruz Sentinel reported it this way.
Once in the U.S., Kanto began traveling the country to raise money for a refugee home and school in Robertsport, Liberia, which will open soon. Residents can come from around the world and will have all their expenses paid while living in the house and attending the in-house school.
During the first George W. Bush administration, there was a famous quote. It was attributed to Karl Rove, but nobody really knows where it came from. It was famously dismissive of the reality-based community. And the idea was that when we act, we create our own reality. We decide what reality is. And that's kind of what I'm reminded of here. The Santa Cruz Sentinel prints that she's starting a boarding school. But you can't just put a dozen kids of mixed ages in one room with no furniture, few supplies, rotating volunteers, and call it a school. Especially when it doesn't have running water, refrigeration, or electricity. There are things I would call that, but school's not one of them. And Healing Center isn't one of them either. Saying residents can come from around the world, that's just marketing copy, not reality. A real international school would need immigration sponsorship, a licensed curriculum, qualified teachers, and safety protocols. They touted it as a school available for international kids, yet later, when they moved to Austin, They claim it's so international kids can join, because only Liberian kids ever lived at the Strongheart House in Liberia. There's no record of accreditation, licensed teachers, or government inspection. A few rotating volunteers with laptops isn't a school. It's theater. It's pretend school. The gap between Strongheart's public narrative and the physical reality on the ground was cavernous. This piece shows exactly how Strongheart's rhetoric turned a bare-bones communal subsistence living setup into a groundbreaking boarding school by sheer force of storytelling. In print, it's an innovative and groundbreaking boarding school, but on the ground, it's a remote compound without utilities, oversight, or structured curriculum. It's the same playbook the director always uses. Call something the opposite of what it is. Using high-minded language about healing and resilience and neuroscience masks the fact that it's unregulated housing and behavior modification, so outsiders will accept this as legitimate. And notice how the press is complicit in laundering every one of these completely made-up stories, convincing us that this is the truth. So what did that money get them? Let's take a look at the actual details of this quote-unquote school. I've read a lot while researching the conditions, the curriculum, and the culture at Strongheart. And I've also heard from former Strongheart staff and participants who live there. They confirmed that the living conditions and the culture were as bad as depicted or worse. If I had to sum it up neatly, I would say that Strongheart was characterized by educational and institutional negligence, psychological gaslighting, and subsistence-level living conditions. The culture of Strongheart was deeply rooted in white cultural supremacy that manifested as both paternalism and neglect. First, let's discuss the actual material conditions. Remember what Corey said about Liberia?
I was living in Liberia at the time, and I was really trying to make sense of what I was seeing in Liberia, because it was just horrific. It was so post-conflict. Everything was destroyed. There were just no, I mean, it was horrible.
An old hotel for wealthy Europeans visiting Liberia that was used by the rebels during the war as an ammunition depot.
A 10,000 square foot former hotel, the structure was taken over by rebels during Liberia's civil war and used as an ammo depot. When we found it, it had withstood 15 years of wear and tear. The roof was missing in many parts. It rained in every room of the house. Green moss grew thick on the walls, and there was a tree sprouting from the second floor. It had been stripped of everything except 3 toilets, which we inherited.
And sometimes I freak out when I'm in this country, because I just feel like the past is still coming back to me. I feel like I'm walking on a land that there's so many blood that was shared here. And just everybody just seems like they're living a normal life. It's hard to live a normal life when you actually think about the horrible things that happen here. It's not easy. It's not easy sitting even in this house or something that once had a lot of guns. People packed their guns here. And you know what our guns did to a lot of people. It's really hard.
Now, the building itself was about 50 meters from the beach. That had pros and cons. Pros because the water was always warm and great for surfing. Cons because of the open defecation that commonly took place on the beach. One of the volunteers commented about her time this way.
I stayed there for 2 weeks. At the house were 8 Liberian youths, ages 14 to 25, 1 10-month-old baby, about 6 Liberian house staff, 1 high school technology teacher from Spain, and 1 American program guide. There was no running water, and electricity was pumped in via generator 3 hours a day.
Because when I was there, I remember there were still bombed out buildings.
Right.
No electricity, no running water. I mean, it was rough in a way that really surprised me.
In the house, there was no running water. Residents took bucket showers, and let's just say the toilets did not flush. In most countries, lack of running water alone would disqualify it from any childcare or residential licensing. Water for drinking, cooking, and bathing had to be hauled in manually from a stream near the property. Each night, they used a generator to get a few hours of electricity. There was no refrigeration, no air conditioning, no ice or cold beverages. There was also no grocery stores in town. Getting supplies involved driving 6 hours round trip on bad roads. And on those roads, be sure to take some money for bribes. You'll need it to get past all the checkpoints. And what about medical care or medicine? Another 6-hour round trip. And that's no small problem because tropical diseases like malaria commonly ripped through the house. Those are just the absolute basics of living. But what about the daily routines required for a group of 13 to 24-year-olds? Were the genders and ages mixed or separated? Housing teenage boys and girls together violates fundamental child safeguarding principles. After the age of 12 or 13, virtually every legitimate child welfare framework requires gender separation for sleeping arrangement and for private facilities like bathrooms. If the boys and girls, or teens and young adults, freely shared common bathrooms and sleeping areas, that would violate every major child welfare standard and safeguarding norm, from the UN, the US State Department, Canada, UK, all of them. In order to protect their privacy, safety, and to prevent sexual grooming and exploitation or peer-to-peer abuse, boys and girls should be housed in different sleeping areas with enforced clear boundaries on bathrooms, showers, and private spaces. And the age matters too, because you can't safely group 13-year-olds with 24-year-olds in a residential environment without strict separation. The developmental, psychological, and sexual maturity differences are enormous. In most places, housing the genders or the ages together would trigger an investigation. No accredited school, orphanage, or transitional program for minors would pass inspection with that kind of a setup. In a regulated residential program, bedrooms would be assigned by age and gender. Bathrooms would have privacy locks and supervision policies. Staff would be background check professionals, present 24/7, not just rotating volunteers or peers. Programs that serve minors must have policies that explicitly prevent potential sexual contact or exploitation. They must maintain a written child protection policy outlining how staff respond to illness, neglect, or reports of abuse. But we don't seem to have any of that here. So the material physical conditions were at a deprivation subsistence level, and all the child welfare norms were pretty much being ignored. But what about the education? Maybe the schooling part is better. In any accredited program, no matter how small, there are a few things you'd expect. 1, certified teachers and a full-time administrator on site they're both background checked and with references on file. 2, a written curriculum that includes reading, writing, and arithmetic, lesson plans, and syllabi. Number 3, assessment tools, quizzes, written assignments, projects, grades, or portfolios. 4, student records, transcripts, attendance, assessments, and some kind of governing body and external accountability. But the absence of those things means the real goal wasn't learning at all, but performing the appearance of learning. The real goal was producing kids who could speak about trauma and healing in ways that could attract donor money. The school was just branding. Strongheart appropriated academic terminology to create the illusion of legitimacy and sound compliant with Western education norms. But it wasn't a school, and presenting it as such is unethical and potentially illegal. They solicited money and reputational capital under the claim of providing an education. But this was never an academic curriculum, just a public relations one. And in practice, it robbed the participants of legitimate education because they can't transfer credits, apply for university, or prove achievement with a certificate from Strongheart. Being in the program itself was supposed to serve as evidence of the transformation, even if no transformation actually existed. And the staff. Strongheart was run by volunteers who came for as little as 2 weeks at a time. They were not required to be credentialed childcare professionals of any kind.
Strongheart is always looking for good volunteers to go to Liberia. The house is located on the beach with the best surf in West Africa. Why not make your next trip a volunteer vacation?
And Corey was recruiting everywhere, even commenting on blogs of people she didn't know, inviting them to visit.
Heidi, we are hardcore 101 Cookbooks fans at Strongheart Fellowship, an awesome global culture home for exceptional young people from extreme circumstances. We're in West Africa, in Liberia, in a great little beach town called Robertsport. Will you come develop some yummy recipes from our cool local produce? We'd love to host you.
The constant arrival of well-meaning outsiders also creates a constant hierarchy of saviors and saved. Every arrival reasserts Western authority, the idea that knowledge, healing, progress, it all comes from the outside world, while local wisdom, that's primitive. And psychologically, for traumatized youth, especially refugees who've already lost their parents and stability, a revolving door of unvetted Western caregivers is emotionally traumatic. Each new volunteer arrives with curiosity and affection, and then leaves after the kids get attached, mostly to never be seen again. That just replays abandonment trauma over and over, teaching the children that love and attention are transactional and fleeting. And all of that is on top of the inherent danger of having minors and unvetted foreign volunteers in shared housing. With no consistent, stable authority figure to supervise and no background checks, the risk to the children's safety skyrockets. So at Strongheart, we have unvetted caregivers operating without protocols, child protection policies, or independent oversight, while teaching an improvised curriculum without cultural relevance. The harm here isn't incidental, it's baked into the structure. Every visit reinforces the same hierarchy that produced the refugees' original displacement: power, pity, and extraction. These conditions could only exist because of the implicit white cultural supremacy ingrained into Strongheart's philosophy and mission. From the original planning group of 10 people that included no Black people or Africans, Strongheart was shaped by a deep paternalism and cultural superiority, and it shows in program design and the writings from staff. And it reminds me of a movie with Steve Martin and Queen Latifah called Bringing Down the House. Queen Latifah is an innocent person framed for a crime, and she catfishes Steve Martin's lawyer character into helping her. But for one night, she has to pretend to be an old-time Black maid for his wealthy racist client. This old lady's fond memories of her maid are triggered by Queen Latifah's presence, and she goes on to tell what she thinks is a sweet, nostalgic story about her and her family's benevolence. The way the old racist lady tells it, after every meal, her family would scrape their leftovers onto a plate for the maid. They thought they were doing her a favor and treating her with special benefits. It reminds me a lot of the power dynamics at Strongheart, giving Black people your leftover garbage and expecting them to be grateful for it. That kind of paternalism is a soft form of white supremacy, a baseline assumption that white people and white culture always know best, and that anything a white person gives you is valuable. How else could white outsiders assume that they know better than African people about what African children need? But you don't have to take my word for it. One of the volunteers chronicled her 3-month experience in 2011 on her blog. Just listen to how improvised this program is on her very first post.
Starting to plan for how teaching will look next week. Homeschooling my son, teaching yoga, and a learning circle, which will probably involve basic writing skills as well as vocabulary, literature, and history.
The learning circle is Strongheart's version of a class.
Good conversation today with Timmy, the other learning circle guide from Nigeria, to map out our plans for the daily schedule of classes and activities, how to approach house rules and tasks, etc. It seems as though we will work together very well. He has a lot of energy and enthusiasm and relates well with the fellows and staff.
They're discussing how to create house rules and class schedules from scratch, not following a pre-existing curriculum or a policy manual. That's proof there was no standardized program or institutional infrastructure, and that the rules were up to whoever happened to be there that day.
Met with Timothy and Essie as the main staff members and worked out our approach to house duties and also how to ensure we have filtered drinking water for everyone.
Working out how to ensure filtered drinking water for everyone shouldn't be the job of the volunteer teacher who just arrived. And the fact that one of the most basic needs of life wasn't already taken into consideration is alarming.
Wow. Amazing morning. Our first day of the semester. Everyone up at 5:45 on their new prana yoga mats, learning breathing techniques, doing challenging yoga movements. Then breakfast on the balcony, then classes started. I worked with Nick on math while Timmy taught a class on finding your calling. Then I taught a class based on the book Wired for Joy, highly recommended. The fellows shared so openly and honestly about their own personal experiences of joy and miracles in their lives, as well as despair and disaster. I feel so blessed to be sharing these discussions with them and sharing work to solidify the skills they already have in coping with what life brings.
First off, the contrast of brand new prana yoga mats, an expensive luxury brand, with the rest of their surroundings is stark. And from the teacher's own writings, we can see these aren't actual academic classes. At most, they're book discussion groups. And fellows being invited to disclose their despair and disaster to a short-term volunteer who doubles as a teacher and a spiritual facilitator is emotionally risky and ethically unsound in a youth program, especially for trauma survivors.
Today, I was inspired to start a science class for my son and some of the fellows. We'll start by studying viruses and bacteria, partly because they are interesting and partly because they are such a large part of our reality here and good to be well informed about. My son is currently recovering from some kind of intestinal parasite.
She simply decides to teach biology because she was inspired. Improvising education around whatever caught their attention that day demonstrates that daily decision-making was driven by enthusiasm and ideology, not by training or regulated procedures. It also highlights how infectious disease actively circulated in the home.
I'm also having my son and a fellow do a survey on a particular virus of interest. My son chose AIDS and has been asking several people in and out of the house what they know about it. We will compile results this week in graphed and written ways. I've been enjoying keeping my hand in being a school teacher, but glad to have just a few students and mostly getting to teach yoga. And from the amazing book, Wired for Joy.
Having her own kid walk around asking, "What do you know about AIDS?" is not education. It's psychologically unsafe and it's professionally indefensible. In a community lacking medical care, where nearly everyone has been touched by war, loss, or illness, AIDS is not a neutral topic. And by their nature, surveys about AIDS extract very personal information about what people know, what they believe, what they fear, what they've seen, and what their community has told them. Questions could bring up stigma, trauma, shame, sexual history, family death, and massive social taboos. There's no confidentiality, there's no choice, there's no safe container. A child asking traumatized young people invasive questions about a stigmatized disease inside the home where they live with no ability to opt out, that's not instruction or education, it's exploitation. Those kinds of disclosures in a house where everyone lives together can easily become social currency, gossip, and psychological leverage. Sensitive topics like HIV/AIDS require trained professionals, informed consent, privacy, and emotional support, none of which existed here. Instead, she reduces generational trauma to a casual project for her child with untrained facilitation sandwiched between yoga and a self-help book. That's basically a recipe for re-traumatization. In a real trauma-informed education curriculum designed by professionals, sensitive topics require structured support, and the students participate voluntarily, and clear boundaries exist between caregiving and education. But here, she's doing the exact opposite. She's blurring roles. Is she guardian, teacher, yoga instructor, pseudo-therapist? Blurring environments. Is it a living space, a classroom, a yoga studio, or a therapy room? And blurring power. The fellows are a captive audience who depend on her for food, shelter, and safety. That makes every lesson, every yoga session, every pop psych activity coercive by default, because the fellows have no autonomy, no privacy, and no informed consent. She frames herself as a teacher, a wellness instructor, an emotional guide, a curriculum designer, an evaluator, all without credentials, oversight, or cultural relevance or expertise. Inside a house that's already functioning as an unregulated institution at a subsistence level of living. The virus surveys were token academics. Informal interviews are not scientific projects. This exercise produced no data collection, hypothesis testing, or safety protocols. It's just classroom theater meant to simulate schooling. It's the illusion of school. Strongheart wasn't a school. It was an improvised patchwork of guided discussions and self-help workshops wrapped in educational and psychological language. This post by the volunteer gives us insight into the logistics of living in Liberia.
On Saturday, I took a trip into Monrovia to do the shopping. It is a 12-hour excursion on bad roads. Quite exhausting and overwhelming, but so good to have a stocked house, and everyone was quite grateful. The fellow who came with me has come down with malaria, so he is slowly recovering from that. People here get malaria countless times, so it tends not to be as seriously debilitating as it is for Westerners.
Quote, everyone was quite grateful. Having the house stocked with food and supplies shouldn't be an occasion for overwhelming gratitude. It should be the baseline default norm. The fact that it wasn't is another red flag. And reframing health neglect as normal, saying that people get malaria countless times and it's not as serious, is just factually wrong and ethically alarming. Recurrent malaria damages organs and can be fatal. And why isn't the fellow allowed to rest at home? Why is he being put to work as a shopping helper when he should be recovering? That's quite a contrast from the director's work documenting global health equity with Bending the Arc, where she talks about her commitment to how everyone deserves top health care no matter where they were born or where they live. I guess that doesn't apply to Robertsport, Liberia. Within just a few weeks of arriving, the volunteer writes this on her blog.
We need donations. There is a spot on the website on which you can donate. We need groceries and money to pay the local staff, keeper, someone to bring the water from the stream for bathing and drinking, etc. Thank you.
This call for donations shows that the house was running hand to mouth without stable funding or reserves. And it's not surprising because at this point, in 2011, donations for the entire year were only $33,000, and Lovetta's jewelry sales were down too, cut by more than half to only $50,000. Less than $100,000 to support 8 to 10 kids plus staff. That's not much money.
We have a pet monitor lizard tied to a tree. Nick brings it dead fish to eat. They say that it will become tame and not need to be tied at some point. Classes have been going well. There is good positive energy in the house, and things are running smoothly. There was a lot of publicity for Strongheart because of Evelyn Apoko, one of the fellows, speaking out about the situation in Uganda, and Rush Limbaugh's comments about the LRA, by whom she was abducted as a child. Brave woman, interviews on CNN, going to Capitol Hill, etc.
The anecdote about the monitor lizard is interesting. I can't help but notice the nod to conditioning learned helplessness. Changing the wild nature of an animal to tame through restricting its freedom so that even when it's set free, it doesn't know how to be free. That same kind of conditioning works on humans too. The closing section pivots to Evelyn Apoko's publicity, linking her CNN and Capitol Hill appearances to a house that's begging for money to afford groceries, exposes the organization's central contradiction. High visibility storytelling and moral branding masking desperate on-the-ground conditions. It juxtaposes two distinct realities in the same post, begging for money to buy food while celebrating national media exposure. That duality, poverty inside, prestige outside, that's a hallmark of a performative humanitarian enterprise. By this point, the pattern is becoming clear. Day-to-day subsistence is framed as positive energy. Unsafe living conditions are romanticized as resilience, and the suffering or heroism of individual fellows is leveraged to attract Western donations.
Last night, we had electronic games night, which meant a giant image of Wii Tennis projected onto the wall. The fellows and Nick had quite a workout. What an odd juxtaposition of technology, our leisure, our wealth, with the facts of poverty and no electricity all around us.
Projecting Wii Tennis onto a wall amid blackout conditions symbolizes the entire Strongheart model, importing Western comfort and novelty into a setting where residents and neighbors live in total scarcity and deprivation.
I went to Monrovia Saturday for grocery shopping, which take all day and involve at least 6 hours of driving. Then the challenge of getting all of our boxes and propane tanks and fresh veggies back to Robertsport. Not an easy task. We arrived near home by 8 p.m., though the taxi would not take us to our house because of the horrendous state of our road, so we had to carry all the items back to the house on our heads.
When the physical environment contradicts the rhetoric of empowerment, what's really being taught is obedience to the image. It's image management.
Tired of confronting your own discomfort around equality? Exhausted by having to relate to people of color as actual peers with agency, insight, and expertise? Try paternalism, the subtle racism that lets you feel enlightened while keeping everyone neatly in their proper place. With paternalism, you'll enjoy features like expert by birthright, why listen when you can explain? After all, you've read about their culture somewhere. Selective empathy engine. Feel deeply for those poor communities, but not enough to see them as equals. The benevolent barrier. Offer lots of help without any power, so they must stay dependent on your charity. And low accountability mode. If anyone calls you out, simply say you didn't mean it that way. Bam! All consequences erased. Side effects may include career advancement through diversity work, unearned credibility, and an unshakable belief that you're the exception. Paternalism, because you're not biased, you're just trying to help.
The white savior narratives aren't just misguided, they're big business. Research shows that many do-it-yourself white humanitarians who founded orphanages relied on rationalization and moralization to justify what they framed as child rescue missions, even though nearly all of them lacked any credentials to work with vulnerable children. The very fact that untrained white foreigners believe that they can meaningfully intervene in complex child protection situations reveals just how persuasive and delusional the white savior script can be. And what makes this system thrive is the near total absence of critique. Many donors and volunteers assume that institutional care is a legitimate response to children who are vulnerable in low and middle income countries. even though orphanages have already been phased out in most high-income nations. But accepting substandard conditions for people of color is part and parcel of white supremacy. And because white volunteers specifically wanted to save orphans, the demand for orphans grew beyond the actual supply. As a result, what do you think the orphanages did? They began recruiting children who weren't actually orphans, children who had living parents or extended family. So a system that claimed to help children actually ends up manufacturing orphans for profit, prestige, and storytelling value. Another inversion of the truth. It's called orphanage tourism, and it doesn't help the kids. It's what fuels the cycle of exploitation. By creating financial incentives for institutions to recruit children that are non-orphans, sometimes through coercion or deception, and then they maintain the poor conditions to elicit sympathy and more donations. ABTA is a trade association. They started the Orphanage Tourism Task Force to help end orphanage tourism.
The opportunity for travelers to visit or volunteer in orphanages overseas, no matter how well-intentioned, is contributing to the global proliferation of orphanages across the developing world, and there is strong evidence of psychological, physical, and emotional harm caused to children by orphanages. Common destinations for orphanage tourism include Africa, South Asia, and South and Central America. These orphanages can also contribute towards incidents of trafficking, where children with families are recruited to pose as orphans and solicit income from visitors. Together, we believe there is no place for tourism within orphanage settings.
In 2018, Australia became the first country to criminalize recruiting children into orphanages as a form of slavery. Since then, the Australian government has agreed to consider making it a criminal offense just to facilitate trips to overseas orphanages that exploit children. Other nations have taken strong regulatory and advisory stances as well. The United Kingdom updated its travel advice to discourage tourists from visiting or volunteering in orphanages, citing serious unintended consequences for vulnerable children and communities. Similarly, the U.S. Department of State has warned that orphanage tourism can contribute to human trafficking and child exploitation. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child emphasizes that children have the right to grow up in a family environment, and institutional care should be a last resort. Organizations like UNICEF, Save the Children, and the British government have all urged travelers to avoid orphanage tourism and instead support family-based care alternatives that protect children's rights and well-being. Because when you combine institutionalized care with poor living conditions, quasi-therapy, volunteer churn, and commercialized trauma storytelling, you're not looking at a legitimate humanitarian organization. It's a performative aid economy. And what they're selling, the product isn't homes for vulnerable children. The product is a chance for a white person to feel good about themselves and to feel like they're a good person. It's designed for the emotional gratification and validation of white Western people, not the actual improvement of Liberians' lives. And we know that because it's 15 years after the fact and very little has changed on the ground in Liberia. The kids aren't getting a real education or real therapy because the actual product being sold isn't helping the kids. The product being sold is the opportunity for white people to feel like they're a good person. Strongheart's daily reality bore no resemblance to the professional therapeutic institution that it claimed to be. It was run without professional educators, licensing, credentials, therapists, or administrators. The program was volunteer-driven and operating at a subsistence level while presenting itself as a formal humanitarian institution. It's not just a poorly designed program, it's a cult-like system of exploitation, using the rhetoric of healing and neuroscience to mask neglect, coercion, and brand extraction from traumatized and vulnerable youth.
Well, it's been a little while since I've posted, partly because I need to conserve laptop battery, partly because I have gotten busy taking on the financial budgeting and accounting here at the house, which has been teaching me a lot about the behind-the-scenes workings of running an establishment here in Liberia. And also, I think, bringing me closer to people here since I am becoming a more integral part of the house.
Foreign Volunteer is now handling the accounting and budgeting for the home. They're teaching, they're running yoga classes, and helping manage visitors. Those aren't just volunteer duties, they're core administrative and educational roles that would normally require vetting, licensing, and oversight.
Have had many lovely daily adventures here recently, and I'm really, really happy. Feeling connected to people, swimming in the warm and calm sea. Feeling like I am being of use, teaching yoga every day. My son is taking on more of a sense of being a part of the house and is becoming more and more willing to help out and be useful, as I say, and as the fellows make fun of me for saying, Had an American visitor stay here last night, it was interesting to be in the position of getting to be the tour guide and seeing this amazing place through another's eyes. It is becoming more like home, like a place that I belong to and that I am happy to share with others.
The volunteer feels she now belongs and is happy to share this amazing place. That's exactly how volunteers are converted into true believers, by giving that emotional reward, being needed, feeling at home. That's exactly how white savior structures and cultic systems bind volunteers. It keeps them emotionally invested while masking the lack of safeguards.
We all, fellows and staff, worked hard yesterday to get the house ready, and everyone worked together to make sure there was delicious food available and clean water in the house, etc. And I think we all felt that sense of accomplishment from working together and creating something successful. Our visitors made a generous donation to the house and gave our dear cook a ride in to Monrovia on their way back so she could attend her brother's funeral.
The volunteer narrates the emotional reward for their work as a sense of accomplishment. That's the psychological trap. Unpaid labor becomes a moral exercise, and pride replaces fair treatment and pay, conditioning participants to comply without questioning or complaining. And did you notice the most glaring red flag we've seen yet? Quote, everyone worked together to get the house ready means the fellows were doing unpaid hospitality prep, cleaning, cooking, fetching water, in order to host outside visitors. In any regulated youth program, staff handles those logistics. Children aren't responsible for presenting the home to donors. And the generous donation right after shows the transactional structure. The kids' efforts become part of the sales pitch. This kind of forced child labor is exploitation. And if it's ongoing, it becomes a modern form of slavery. But surely that's not something these vulnerable children need to worry about, is it?
We hope to start a small pepper garden in the yard this week, and we'll be inventorying the house to get ready to start opening it up as a guest house. So lots of projects.
Excuse me. Preparing to, quote, open it up as a guest house? You can't rent rooms to strangers on a property that is supposed to be a permanent home base of healing for orphaned refugees. That is illegal under every child protection framework in existence. But taking the child's safety and best interests into consideration does not seem to be a concern for the Strongheart staff. Next time, two surfers rename the building the Quenpuha Surf Retreat. But why are they in the press taking credit for the rehab job?
They funded the retreat with their savings and money from a small group of investors. It took enormous work to make Quenpuha a reality. Aided by local workers, they repaired the ruins of a luxury hotel. They pulled out trees that had sprouted in now roofless living rooms and filled in walls pockmarked with bullet holes to create an airy hostel. Quenpuha opened in 2012.
Where are the kids? And what about their permanent home base of healing? Find out next time on The Unraveling, How Your Reality is Made Up. The Unraveling, How Your Reality is Made Up is written, produced, and narrated by me, Micah Ringo. You can find all my references and sources in the show notes. This podcast does not suggest that any of Corey Stern's associates or any of the children were willing, knowing accessories to criminal acts.